Sir, this section is for designated family only. Step back or security will escort you out. That's what they told 72-year-old Frank Thompson. He didn't argue. He just stood there in his old marine dress blues, holding the handwritten invitation his son had sent him 3 weeks ago. Dad, I want you in the front row for my graduation. You earned it. They thought he didn't belong. But 6 Navy SEALs sitting quietly in the back rows knew exactly who he was. And when they stood up, everything was about to change. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside University's campus in Ohio. Frank had driven his old Ford pickup truck 4 hours from his small apartment in Toledo, leaving before dawn. His arthritis made the drive painful, but nothing would keep him from seeing his boy Marcus walk across that stage. Frank smoothed his uniform jacket, the same one he'd worn to receive his Purple Heart 30 years ago. The sleeves were a bit loose now. He'd lost weight since Sarah passed. But it was still the best thing he owned, still pressed sharp as the day he'd first put it on at Paris Island. The graduation hall buzzed with excited families. Mothers in their Sunday best, fathers adjusting their ties, grandparents clutching bouquets of flowers. Frank made his way toward the front, moving slowly but purposefully. His left leg still gave him trouble from the shrapnel he'd taken in Desert Storm. That's when he saw the rope barriers and the little signs. Reserved family seating. Invitation required. A young woman with a clipboard and headset blocked his path. Sir, this section is for designated family only. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter. His son's handwriting, blue ink on college letterhead. My son's graduating today. Marcus Thompson. He asked me to sit up front. The woman barely glanced at the letter. You'll need an official invitation, sir. Please step back to general seating. Frank looked past her at the empty chairs in the front row. One had a small placard, reserved for M. Thompson family. His chest tightened. After everything he'd sacrificed, after all those nights he'd worked double shifts at the steel mill to pay for Marcus's tuition, they were treating him like he didn't belong. But Frank Thompson had learned long ago when to fight and when to step back. He nodded once and moved to the side wall, taking position near the emergency exit. Old habits die hard. He always knew where the exits were. That's when he noticed them. 6 men scattered throughout the back section, all wearing civilian clothes, but sitting with that unmistakable military posture. Their eyes had been tracking him since he walked in. One of them, a tall man with graying temples, caught Frank's eye and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Frank straightened his shoulders and faced the stage. He'd come here for Marcus, and he wasn't leaving until he saw his son graduate, no matter where they made him stand. The lights dimmed, and the ceremony began with all the pomp and circumstance of academic tradition. Dean Patricia Williams took the podium, welcoming families and distinguished guests. The crowd settled into polite applause as she introduced the valedictorian. Frank watched from his position by the wall, hands clasped behind his back in military rest position. He'd stood this way for hours during inspections, during briefings, during ceremonies far more dangerous than this one. A college graduation should have felt peaceful by comparison. But something was eating at him. Maybe it was the way that young woman had looked right through him, like he was invisible. Maybe it was seeing all those other fathers in their front row seats, checking their phones and chatting casually about things that seemed so small compared to what really mattered. The valedictorian was Dean Williams' son, Connor, a polished young man in an expensive suit who spoke about excellence and achievement. His words were smooth, practiced, probably rehearsed in front of a mirror 100 times. And a special thanks, Connor said with a slight smirk, to all the respectable families here in the front rows, reminding us what true academic values look like. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Frank felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard that tone before, the casual dismissal of people who didn't fit someone's idea of respectable. He'd heard it in officers' clubs where enlisted men weren't welcome, in restaurants where his uniform drew stares, in 100 different places where his service meant nothing to people who'd never served anything but themselves. From the back of the room, Frank heard a low voice mutter. That was meant for him. He glanced back to see the tall man with gray temples leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Frank with an intensity that made the air feel charged. The ceremony continued, but Frank could feel the weight of those 6 pairs of eyes on him. Whatever was building in this room, He sensed it was bigger than just one old Marine being denied a decent seat at his son's graduation. Then the ushers started moving again, this time with security in tow. Frank's old instincts kicked in. He could smell trouble coming from a mile away, and it was headed straight for him. Two security guards approached Frank, their faces set with the kind of artificial authority that comes from wearing a uniform without earning it. The lead guard was young, maybe 25, with soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a clipboard. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the guard said, trying to make his voice sound commanding. "You're disrupting the ceremony." Frank looked at him steadily. He'd been questioned by colonels and generals, interrogated by enemy soldiers, and faced down armed insurgents in 3 different countries. This kid with his mall cop authority didn't even register as a threat. "I'm not disrupting anything," Frank said quietly. "I'm standing here watching my son graduate. That's all I came to do." "You need to leave the building, sir. You don't belong here." Those words hit Frank like a physical blow. Don't belong here. After 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and 26 years of service. After working 60-hour weeks at the steel mill to put Marcus through school. After raising his boy alone when Sarah died of cancer. Never missing a parent-teacher conference or a baseball game. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out Marcus's letter, unfolding it carefully. The paper was soft from being read so many times. "My son wrote this," he said, holding it out. "He asked me to be here, in the front row." The second guard stepped closer, hand moving to his radio. "Sir, you need to come with us now, or we'll have to use force." Frank looked at the letter one more time, then folded it and put it back in his pocket. He'd learned long ago that some battles couldn't be won with words. He nodded once and prepared to follow them out. That's when he heard the scraping of chairs behind him. One chair, then another, then 4 more. Frank turned to see all 6 men from the back rows standing up in unison. They moved with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together, fought together, bled together. The tall one with gray temples stepped forward first, reaching into his jacket. What he pulled out made Frank's breath catch in his throat. A Navy SEAL trident, gold and gleaming under the auditorium lights. The man held it up so everyone could see, then looked directly at the security guards. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded respect in places where hesitation meant death. "That man doesn't leave this room," he said. "He led us through hell and brought us home. He stays right here." The auditorium went dead silent. Even the dean stopped talking mid-sentence. One by one, the other 5 men pulled out their own tridents, holding them high. Frank stared at them in shock, his mind racing back through the years, through the fog of war and the chaos of battle, trying to place their faces. Then it hit him. Afghanistan, 2003. A joint operation that had gone sideways fast. He remembered now. The young SEALs he'd pulled out of that burning compound. The boys he'd carried to safety while bullets whistled around them like angry hornets. They weren't boys anymore. They were grown men with gray in their hair and lines around their eyes. But they remembered. After 20 years, they remembered. And they weren't going to let anyone throw him out of his son's graduation. The security guards froze, looking back and forth between the SEALs and their supervisor, who had suddenly appeared looking pale and nervous. The young woman with the clipboard stood with her mouth open, finally understanding that she'd made a very big mistake. But the real surprise came from the side of the auditorium, where an older man in a dress uniform stood up. His chest was covered with ribbons and medals that caught the light like small pieces of history. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command authority. "I know that man," the colonel said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "His name is Master Sergeant Frank Thompson, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Retired." Frank's heart hammered in his chest. He recognized that voice, though it had aged since he'd last heard it. Colonel James Mitchell, his old commanding officer. In 2003, during Operation Desert Falcon, Mitchell continued, "I watched Sergeant Thompson run back into a burning compound under heavy enemy fire. Not once, but 3 times. He pulled out 5 wounded SEALs and 2 Marines who would have died without him." The colonel's voice grew stronger, carrying to every corner of the now silent auditorium. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't ask for permission. He just went. Because that's what Marines do. That's what Frank Thompson has always done. Frank felt his face burning. He'd never wanted this attention, never asked for recognition. He'd done what any Marine would do, what any decent man would do. You don't leave people behind. Not ever. He was awarded the Navy Cross for valor that day, Mitchell said. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, placing the lives of his fellow Marines above his own safety." But that doesn't tell the whole story. The colonel looked directly at Frank, and for a moment, 20 years fell away. It doesn't tell you that he carried a wounded SEAL on his back for 2 miles through enemy territory. It doesn't tell you that he gave his own blood to keep another Marine alive during the evacuation. It doesn't tell you that he spent 6 months in a hospital recovering from his wounds, and the first thing he asked about when he woke up was whether his boys made it home. Frank closed his eyes, remembering the weight of those young soldiers on his back, the sound of their labored breathing, the way their blood had mixed with the desert sand. He remembered the fear in their eyes and the way it had driven him forward when his own body was screaming for him to stop. "They all made it home," Mitchell said. "Every single one. Because of him." A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just some old man who'd wandered into the wrong section. This was a genuine American hero being treated like he didn't matter. Frank opened his eyes to find hundreds of people staring at him, some with shame, some with awe, but all with a new understanding of who was standing in their midst. The lead security guard looked down at his feet, his authority crumbling like sand. The woman with the clipboard backed away slowly, clutching her papers like they might protect her from the weight of what she'd done. But Frank wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the stage, where a young man in cap and gown had stepped up to the microphone with tears in his eyes. His son, Marcus, about to change everything. Marcus Thompson gripped the microphone with shaking hands, looking out at the sea of faces staring back at him. At 22, he was tall like his father, but leaner, with his mother's gentle eyes and his dad's stubborn chin. He'd been valedictorian of his high school class, earned a full scholarship to Riverside University, and was graduating summa cum laude with a degree in engineering. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the man standing by the emergency exit, the man who'd raised him alone after Mom died, the man who'd worked 3 jobs to make sure Marcus never went without. "That's my dad," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. "Frank Thompson, and he's the best man I've ever known." The auditorium was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Marcus looked directly at his father, drawing strength from those steady gray eyes that had guided him through every important moment of his life. "When I was 8 years old," Marcus continued, "I asked my dad why he limped sometimes. He told me it was from an old football injury. I believed that story until I was 16 and found his medals hidden in a shoebox in the closet. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Navy Cross. When I asked him about them, you know what he said?" Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He said, "Those are just pieces of metal, son. What matters is what you do with the life you're given." Then he went back to helping me with my math homework like nothing had happened. A few people in the audience were crying now, including some of the mothers in the front row who'd been laughing at Connor Williams' joke about respectable families just minutes earlier. "My dad worked the night shift at Thompson Steel for 15 years, Marcus said. Came home every morning at 7, made me breakfast, walked me to school, then slept for 4 hours before getting up to help me with homework. On weekends, he coached my little league team. He never missed a game. Not one." Frank felt his throat tightening. He remembered those Saturday mornings, teaching Marcus how to hold a bat, how to feel the grounder, how to look an opponent in the eye and show no fear. The same lessons he'd learned in boot camp, adapted for baseball diamonds and playground politics. When Mom got sick, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. Dad took a second job to pay for her treatments. Then a third job when the insurance ran out. He didn't sleep for 2 years. I used to find him at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, paying bills by lamplight, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. The silence in the auditorium had a weight to it now, heavy with recognition and growing shame. These people were beginning to understand what they'd almost done, how close they'd come to throwing out a man who embodied everything they claimed to respect. After Mom died, Marcus said, "Dad could have given up, could have sent me to live with relatives, could have drowned his sorrows in a bottle like some of his friends did. Instead, He got up every day and kept going. For me. Because that's what good fathers do. Marcus stepped out from behind the podium, his graduation gown rustling as he moved. Today I'm graduating with honors from one of the best engineering programs in the country. I've got a job waiting at Boeing, designing aircraft that will keep American pilots safe. And none of it would have happened without that man over there. He pointed directly at Frank, and every head in the auditorium turned to follow his gesture. Frank stood straighter, not with pride, but with the quiet dignity that had carried him through 30 years of service and 20 years of fatherhood. So when I sent him that invitation, Marcus said, his voice ringing with conviction, when I asked him to sit in the front row, it wasn't a request. It was an honor he earned 1,000 times over. Marcus began walking down the steps, moving toward his father with determined strides. The crowd parted before him like water, understanding finally that they were witnessing something sacred. When he reached Frank, Marcus stopped and looked into his father's eyes that had seen war and loss and struggle, but had never stopped believing in the possibility of something better for his son. Then, in a slow, practiced motion that he'd learned from watching old Marine ceremony videos on YouTube, Marcus brought his hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture said everything that words couldn't. Thank you. I'm proud of you. You are my hero. Frank's composure finally broke. 20 years of holding it together, of being strong for his boy, of never letting Marcus see how much it all hurt sometimes. It all came flooding out in one moment of pure, overwhelming love. He stepped forward and pulled his son into his arms, holding him tight against his chest the way he had when Marcus was small and frightened by nightmares. Except this time, Frank was the one who needed comforting. I love you, son, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. Behind them, 6 Navy SEALs stood at attention, their own hands raised in salutes that honored not just Frank Thompson, but the brotherhood that binds those who serve. Colonel Mitchell saluted as well, his weathered face streaked with tears. And in that moment, the front row didn't matter anymore. The reserved seating and the official invitations and all the petty protocols that divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy, none of it mattered. What mattered was love and sacrifice and the understanding that some things can't be measured by college degrees or bank accounts or social standing. Some things can only be measured by the content of a man's character. The standing ovation began slowly, starting with the 6 SEALs and Colonel Mitchell, then spreading like ripples on a pond. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not just for Frank Thompson, but for everything he represented: sacrifice, service, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Frank stood with his arm around Marcus's shoulders, overwhelmed by the moment. He'd never asked for recognition, never wanted to be the center of attention. But as he looked out at all those faces, many wet with tears, all filled with respect, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt seen, truly seen, for who he was and what he'd given. Dean Williams approached the microphone, her face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than before, lacking the confident authority she'd displayed earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, we have made a grave error today. Mr. Thompson, would you please come forward? Frank looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Together, father and son walked toward the front of the auditorium, past the rope barriers that had seemed so important just an hour ago, past the reserved seating that had been denied to the man who'd earned it more than anyone. The young woman with the clipboard, her name tag read, Jessica, stood frozen as they passed, her face red with mortification. She'd been so quick to judge, so certain of her authority, so blind to the possibility that she might be wrong. Frank paused beside her. For a moment, Jessica looked terrified, probably expecting anger or harsh words. Instead, Frank's voice was gentle. It's okay, he said quietly. You were just doing your job. The simple grace of those words hit harder than any rebuke could have. Jessica burst into tears, covering her face with her hands as the weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Dean Williams gestured toward the front row, where Marcus's reserved seat sat empty beside several others. Mr. Thompson, please, take your rightful place. Frank sat down slowly, his old bones grateful for the comfortable chair. Marcus sat beside him, still wearing his cap and gown, his diploma temporarily forgotten. Around them, the ceremony resumed, but the tone had fundamentally changed. When Dean Williams announced the graduates' names, each student received respectful applause. But when she called Marcus Thompson, Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering, summa cum laude, the ovation was thunderous. Marcus walked across the stage with his head high, not because of his academic achievements, but because of the man sitting in the front row watching with tears in his eyes. As Marcus accepted his diploma and posed for the traditional handshake photo, he looked out into the audience and found his father's face. Frank gave him a thumbs up, the same gesture he'd used at Little League games and school plays and every other milestone moment in his son's life. Some traditions, the good ones, never change. After the ceremony, as families gathered on the lawn for pictures and celebration, something remarkable happened. People sought Frank out. Parents who'd barely noticed him before came up to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Students approached to hear stories about his time in the Marines. Children stared at him with wide-eyed wonder, the way kids look at real-life superheroes. The 6 SEALs formed a circle around Frank and Marcus, sharing memories of that day in Afghanistan when a grizzled Marine sergeant had risked everything to bring them home. They talked about the letters Frank had written to their families, the way he'd visited them in the hospital, how he'd stayed in touch long after his own wounds had healed. "You never told me about the letters," Marcus said to his father. Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. They were just kids, far from home. Their families needed to know they were okay. Colonel Mitchell joined the group, his dress uniform a stark contrast to Frank's faded marine blues. "He wrote to my wife too," Mitchell said. "After I was wounded in the same operation. Told her I was going to be fine, that he'd personally make sure I got the best care. Helen still has that letter. Says it got her through the worst week of her life." Frank looked embarrassed by the praise, the way truly humble people always do when their good deeds are brought to light. He'd simply done what needed doing, the way he always had. As the sun began to set over the campus, Marcus finally asked the question that had been building all day. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? About the medals, about what you did over there?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching families pack up their cameras and fold their lawn chairs. "Because that's not who I wanted to be for you," he finally said. "I didn't want to be the war hero dad, living in the past. I wanted to be the dad who helped with homework and taught you to throw a curveball and made pancakes on Sunday mornings." He looked at his son with eyes full of love and hard-won wisdom. "The most important battle I ever fought wasn't in Afghanistan, son. It was right here at home, trying to raise you to be a good man. And looking at you today, in that cap and gown, knowing the kind of person you've become, that's the victory I'm proudest of." Marcus hugged his father again, understanding finally why Frank had hidden his medals in a shoebox. Some heroes wear their glory on their sleeves. Others carry it quietly in their hearts, too busy making the world better to worry about getting credit for it. As they walked toward Frank's old pickup truck, the 6 SEALs fell into formation around them, not as bodyguards, but as an honor guard for a man who taught them the true meaning of courage. And somewhere behind them, Jessica the usher watched through her tears, learning a lesson about judgment and grace that no college course could ever teach. 3 months later, Frank Thompson stood in his small apartment in Toledo, looking at the framed photo on his mantelpiece. Marcus in his cap and gown, both of them smiling, surrounded by 6 Navy SEALs and a Marine colonel. It had been the best day of Frank's life, even better than the day he'd received his Navy Cross. Marcus called every Sunday now from his new job in Seattle, designing aircraft that would keep American pilots safe. He'd insisted on sending money to help with Frank's medical bills, but Frank had sent it back. "You keep that money, son," he told him. "Save it for your own kids someday." The phone rang, interrupting Frank's memories. It was Dean Williams from Riverside University. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I'm calling to invite you to be our commencement speaker next year. We'd be honored to have you address our graduates." Frank smiled, thinking about all those young faces looking up at him, probably expecting war stories and tales of heroic deeds. "I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I don't think I'm the right man for that job." "Sir, with all due respect, I think you're exactly the right man. Our students need to hear from someone who understands what real service looks like." After a long pause, Frank agreed, but only on one condition. "I don't want to talk about war," he said. "I want to talk about being a good father. About showing up every day, even when it's hard. About putting someone else's dreams ahead of your own." "That sounds perfect," Dean Williams said. The next spring, Frank stood behind the same podium where Connor Williams had made his joke about respectable families. The irony wasn't lost on him. But this time, when he looked out at the audience, he saw something different in their faces. Hope, respect, the understanding that heroism isn't always about dramatic gestures or battlefield courage. Sometimes it's about getting up every morning and doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching. "My son graduated from this university last year," Frank began, his voice steady and clear. "Some of you might remember the day. It caused quite a stir. I got thrown out, then invited back in, and it all became a bigger deal than it needed to be." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, graduates in their caps and gowns, parents clutching tissues, faculty members sitting at attention. "But I'm not here to talk about that day. I'm here to talk about all the days before it. The days when nobody was watching, when there were no cameras or applause or newspaper articles. The days that really mattered." Frank went on to tell them about midnight feedings and homework help, about Little League games and science fair projects, about working 3 jobs and falling asleep at the kitchen table. He talked about the small sacrifices that parents make every day, the way love shows up in packed lunches and clean laundry and bedtime stories. "Being a hero," he concluded, "isn't about what you do when the whole world is watching. It's about what you do when it's just you and the people who count on you, when nobody will ever know if you took the easy way out or did the hard thing because it was right." The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. But the real victory came afterward, when dozens of young graduates approached him with tears in their eyes, promising to call their parents, to say thank you, to remember that the people who raised them are the real heroes in their stories. As Frank drove home that evening, he thought about Marcus, probably just getting off work at Boeing, probably designing something that would keep some other father's child safe in the sky. He thought about Sarah, and how proud she would have been to see their boy graduate. He thought about the men he'd served with, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't, and how they'd all understand what he'd learned over the years. The greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in living rooms and at kitchen tables, in hospital waiting rooms and school parking lots. They're fought by ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the ones they love. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to see the victory parade. You get to sit in the front row and watch your child walk across that stage, knowing that everything you sacrificed was worth it. Frank Thompson pulled into his driveway as the sun was setting, another day of service behind him. Tomorrow he'd get up and do it again, because that's what good fathers do. They show up. They serve. They love without counting the cost. And sometimes, when they least expect it, the whole world stops to salute them back. From Everyday Hero Flies, where ordinary people do extraordinary things, and every father is someone's first hero.